Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more Esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Rudolph Steiner. We are on Building Stones for an Understanding of the Mystery of Golgotha Lecture 2. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It's not the format for everybody, but some people seem to find enjoyment in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, as well as the box down below with the original source material, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I stand in the positions where I do. Almost certainly to be of use today, again, is going to be the unconventional Bible study. I will more than likely direct you to it several times as we go along. With that being said, let us dive in and continue our exploration of building stones for an understanding of the mystery of Golgotha. Yesterday we saw, or in the last video, we saw the church separating humanity from spirit. Let's see what we get today. This was April 3rd, 1917 in Berlin. The mystery of Golgotha, for which I have already prepared the ground in recent lectures, will be the subject of our inquiry today. Let us recall the main points for consideration. I mentioned on the last occasion that in order to arrive at a true understanding of the world, we must study the tripartite division of the cosmos and man in the light of the three principles of body, soul, and spirit. It is most important to be aware of this fact at the present time, especially in the field of anthroposophy. I should like to remind you that this idea of trichotomy forms the central theme of my book, Theosophy. We have covered that. It is available. No doubt you have all read this book and will know that this idea forms the nucleus of the whole book. I quote the relevant passage. The spirit is eternal. The body is subject to life and death in accordance with the laws of the physical world. The soul life, which is subject to destiny, mediates between these two, body and spirit, during life on earth. Now, at the time of the publication of this book, I felt it was necessary to define clearly this idea of trichotomy. For, by laying special, even decisive emphasis upon this idea, we are really in a position today to understand the cosmos and at the same time to understand the central event of our Earth evolution, the mystery of Golgotha. In my last lecture, I spoke of the solid body of opposition we encounter today when we set out to study both cosmos and man in the light of the threefold principle of body, soul, and spirit. Not simply as something of secondary importance, but as the central theme of our study. I have shown how the idea of the spirit was lost in the course of spiritual evolution of the West. I mentioned that the idea of spirit was prescribed by the Eighth Ecumenical Council of Constantinople, and that this prescription not only influenced the development of religious ideas and sentiments, but left a deep impression upon the thinking of recent times. In consequence, there are few modern philosophers who are able to distinguish clearly between soul and spirit, and even amongst those who imagine themselves to be objective, one encounters everywhere the dogmatic assertion, stemming from the Eighth Ecumenical Council, that man consists of body and soul alone. He who is familiar with the spiritual life of the West, not only as it is reflected in the more superficial realms of philosophy, but as it has implanted itself in the thinking and feeling of all men, even of those who have not the slightest interest in philosophical ideas, sees everywhere the effects of the prescription of the idea of the spirit. And when, in ancient times, in recent times, a tendency developed to draw upon certain aspects of the wisdom teachings of the East as a corrective to Western teachings, the borrowings were presented in such a light that one would scarcely suspect that the cosmos and man are founded on the threefold principle of body, soul, and spirit. For in the division of man into gross body, etheric body, and astral body, derived purely from astral observations, Suthula Sharira, Linga Sharira, Prana, as it was called then, Kama, Kama Manas, and the various other divisions introduced from the East, In all these divisions, which are an arbitrary collection of 7 principles, there is no indication of what should be regarded of vital importance, namely that our Weltanschauung should be permeated with this idea of trichotomy. There is no doubt that this idea of man's threefold nature has been suppressed. The spirit, it is true, has often been a focus of discussion today, but the discussions are little more than empty words. People are unable to distinguish nowadays between mere words and realities. Hence, many expositions are taken seriously which are little more than a farrago of words, such as the philosophy of Eucken. We cannot understand the essential nature of the mystery of Golgotha if we decide to reject the tripartite division of man. As I pointed out in my last lecture, the abolition of the spirit was first decreed by the Eighth Ecumenical Council, but preparations had been underway for some time. The ultimate abolition of the spirit is connected with a necessary stage in the spiritual evolution of the West. We shall, perhaps, be able to approach the mystery of Golgotha most easily from the standpoint of the tripartite division of man if we recall how Aristotle, the leading representative of Greek thought, envisaged the soul. The Middle Ages were also dominated by Aristotelian philosophy, and though people are unwilling to admit it, modern thought still draws upon the concepts of the Middle Ages. Furthermore, the later evolution of thought was already anticipated in Aristotle a few centuries before the mystery of Golgotha. And it was with the help of his ideas that the leading minds of the Middle Ages sought to understand the mystery of Golgotha. These things are of paramount importance, and we must really make an effort to investigate them with an open mind. What was Aristotle's conception of the human soul? I will tell you as briefly as possible the Greek view of the soul as presented by an enlightened mind such as Aristotle. His conception of the soul, and we have here the views of the most famous Europeans of the 4th century BC, was roughly as follows. When an individual incarnates, he owes his physical existence to his father and mother, but he owes only his physical inheritance to his parents. The whole man, according to Aristotle, could never come into being solely through the union of father and mother, for this man is endowed with a soul. Now, one part of the soul, let us remember that Aristotle distinguishes 2 parts of the soul, is tied to the physical body, expresses itself through the body, and apprehends the external world through sense perception. This part of the soul arises as a necessary byproduct of man's parental inheritance. The spiritual part of the soul, on the other hand, the active reason, as Aristotle calls it, which participates through intellection in the spiritual life of the universe, is the nous, is immaterial and immortal, and could never come into being through parental inheritance, but solely through the participation of God, or the divine, as Aristotle calls it, in the procreation of man through the parents. Yes. Yes. That's the long and the short of it, right? We have talked before about the Trinity, the body, the soul, and the spirit. The body is the temple. It is the part that you navigate 5D space with. The soul is the part of the individualized piece of God that is you, that makes the individualized decisions. And the spirit is the part that allows that to happen. It is the now becoming the next. It is the future unfolding. The physical piece of the sperm and the egg combining is attributed to your parents. That is the creation of a new temple. It only happens through the intervention of the spirit. The spirit is the part that takes this strand of DNA from the egg and this strand of this DNA from the sperm and interweaves them into a new strand of DNA. That is the becoming. That is the part of the spirit. And as that happens, a new individualized section of God becomes the soul of that. It is an intricate, involved process. It is why I stand against abortion, right? I believe that it begins at the interweaving of those two DNAs, and that if it is meant to be, then it is meant to be, and you should definitely not kill it. That sets me apart from a lot of people, and I am fine with that. Some people think that it's okay at 8 weeks. Some people think that it's okay at 12 weeks. Some people think that it's okay at 9 months. That's up to you. I believe that life begins when that DNA is intermingled. When my DNA mingled with my wife's DNA and became our children, that's when it became life. It didn't wait for a heartbeat. It didn't wait for pain. It didn't wait for thought. It was already alive. Was it fully cognizant? Probably not. Was it able to sustain life on its own? No. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't alive. It is, again, something that sets me apart, but I am perfectly fine with being set apart. And so I am in agreement with this, right? That is a divine intervention to create new life, to ensoul the temple, right? It is thus that the whole man comes into existence. The whole man is born of the cooperation of God with the father and mother, and it is most important to realize that Aristotle understands the word man in this sense. From God, man receives his spiritual soul, or active reason, as Aristotle calls it. This active reason, which comes into being with each individual through divine cooperation, evolves during life between birth and death. When man passes through the gate of death, the physical body is given over to the earth, and with the body, the lower part of the soul, the passive reason, in Aristotelian terminology, which is associated with the physical organism. The spiritual part of the soul, the active reason, on the other hand, subsists, according to Aristotle, and when separated, appears just as it is, withdraws to a world remote from the phenomenal world, and enjoys immortality. Now, this immortal life is such that the man who performed good deeds whilst in the body is able to look back upon the fruits of his good deeds, but cannot change the karma of his past actions. We only understand Aristotle aright when we interpret his ideas as implying that through all eternity, the soul looks back on the good or evil it has wrought. And again, I agree. I believe that we are here voluntarily, that the soul is immortal. The individualized piece of the divine cannot be killed. It is immortal. It was somewheres prior to being incorporated in the temple that it resides in, and it will be somewheres after the destruction of the temple that is. It is an eternal process, and I believe that you do indeed get to go and look back. Not just at the good deeds, but at all the deeds. You get the answers to all of the whys. You get the answers to all of the whats. All of the questions are answered immediately upon return. Are there karmic implications? Yes, but that is involved in. I believe that we are here for lessons, that part of the reason why we are incorporated here is to learn lessons. Some of those lessons are pleasant. Some of those lessons are decidedly unpleasant, but regardless, you are here to learn them. I believe that you, as a soul, prior to incorporation, agreed to learn these lessons. That you, as a soul, are endeavoring to without the knowledge that that is what you are doing. That when you die and your soul is no longer taking possession of this temple and it falls back into the various elements, that you get the immediate knowledge of which test you passed, which lessons you learned, and which ones you didn't. And then you get an opportunity to reincarnate. It is, again, a voluntary thing. This is not a prison. You are not chained. You are not bound. You are not held back. You are here to experience this experience, to feel the things that are not able to, or God is not able to. God has no concept of grief, right? This is the one I use because it is the easiest to hit upon. When you die, you return to Him. There is no hell. That is not really even a Christian concept, according to the New Testament. It is definitely not a Judaic concept, according to the Old Testament. They didn't believe that. They believed that there was a place where the body went, or where the soul went. That I agree with. I believe that it returns to source and that you get those answers. The karma is whether or not you learned the lessons appropriately. Some of the lessons are to resist temptation, right? And if you did not resist temptation in the correct manner, then you get another chance to do so. But at this time, that the lessons are going to be just a little bit more reinforced. That happens in your life, is you fail to learn the lessons. The lesson is repeated, and it is repeated with more severity, right? Up to the point where it is diminishing returns. That is one of the 8 laws of creation. But you are here to learn these lessons, and if you do not learn these lessons, you get the opportunity to come back and learn them again in a different temple, through a different incarnation, with basically the same soul. There may even be some differentiation in the individualized soul. That is a mechanic that I'm not even concerned about, right? I am not really worrying about whether it is literally the exact same soul. You return to source and he may differentiate a different piece with slightly different variations. That is perfectly acceptable to me. In the 19th century, especially, scholars were at pains to grasp this idea, for the style of Aristotle is economical to the point of obscurity. In his controversy with Edward Zeller, the late Franz Brentano, original note 1. Now, I have taken the liberty to pull these up, and there is literally not a whole lot in here, right? We get that Guénon is a female monkey, and then note 4 is a Russian Revolution, but the other 2 are references back to other parts of the lectures. So, Franz Brentano endeavored throughout his life to gather every scrap of evidence which could throw light upon Aristotle's conception of the relationship between the spiritual part of man and the whole man. Aristotle's views passed over into the philosophy which was taught throughout the Middle Ages down to recent times, and which is still taught in certain ecclesiastical circles today. Franz Brentano, who was actively interested in these ideas, insofar as they stem from Aristotle, came to the following conclusion. The mind of Aristotle, which by its virtue of inherent disposition towards reflective thought, transcended the limitations of materialism, could not have subscribed to the notion that the spiritual part of the world was in any way material, or could have evolved from man's parental inheritance. There were only 2 possible ways, therefore, Brentano thought, in which Aristotle could envisage the soul. On the one hand, to accept the idea of the spiritual part of the soul was a direct creation of God working in conjunction with the parental inheritance, so that the spiritual part of the soul arose through divine influence upon the human embryo, and that this spiritual part did not perish at death, but entered upon eternal life. What other possibility was open to Aristotle, Brentano asked, if he rejected this idea? And he believed that Aristotle was right to accept this idea. There was only a second possibility, a third did not exist, and this was to admit not only the post-existence, but also the pre-existence of the soul before birth or conception, which we have just talked about, right? I do believe that. I don't know that there is just the existence and after. I believe that there has to be a pre. It came from somewhere. Nothing can be created nor destroyed. All things are the one. Now, Brentano realized clearly that once we admit the possibility that the soul exists before conception, then we are forced to concede that the soul does not experience a single incarnation only, but undergoes successive incarnations. And since, in later life, Aristotle rejects palingenesis, in example reincarnation, he had no option but to accept creationalism, the doctrine that the soul is created ex nihilo with each embryonic life. I disagree with that, but we've already talked about it. This accepts post-existence but denies pre-existence. That is illogical. Franz Brentano, who had been a priest, may be regarded as one of the last representatives of the positive side of Aristotelian scholastic philosophy. He thought it was eminently reasonable on the part of Aristotle to reject the doctrine of reincarnation and to recognize only creationalism as post-existence. That fits rather well with the control system of the time. And this view, despite its many modifications, forms the core of all Christian philosophy, insofar as this philosophy rejects the idea of reincarnation. It is a strange phenomenon, both touching and tragic, to see how such an eminent scholar as Franz Brentano, who had resigned from the ministry, resolutely strove to clarify his ideas about creationalism, and yet could not bridge the gap which separated him from the doctrine of reincarnation. What was the reason for this? It was evident that, despite his profound erudition, despite the vigor and acuity of his mind, the door to the spirit was closed to him. He could never attain to the idea of the spirit, or recognize the spirit as separate from the soul. It is not possible to attain to the idea of the spirit without accepting the idea of reincarnation. I don't know about that. The idea of reincarnation is inseparable from the idea of the spirit. In Aristotle's day, the idea of the spirit had already begun to decline. In the key passages of Aristotle's writings, we observe that when he touches upon the question of pre-existence, he becomes obscure or ambiguous. Now, I hold, as we have already discussed, that reincarnation is probably a thing, right? I don't say that with the certainty that I do other things, because I do not have recollections of a previous life. And so, at that point, it is still speculation. It is, however, logically consistent. It makes sense using the 8 laws of creation. The very first law, all things are one. Nothing can be created nor destroyed that does not already exist. It can be combined into something new, but that does not preclude the fact that it did not, right? And so, in part, I can understand the logic and the reasoning behind where they stood, but the separation of reincarnation from the spirit is a thing, right? I believe that reincarnation is a thing. I believe that you existed prior to and will exist after, but that doesn't mean that the spirit is not equally valid. There can be a individualized piece of you that is taken from the divine and placed into the body that never has to relearn the lessons. I find that a little bit inconsistent with my own doctrines, right? So the things that I believe. And so I disagree. I believe that we are here to learn the lessons. That is a fundamental part of it. And failure to learn the lessons means that they still need to be learned. And so you come back, in my opinion. But the spirit is something completely separate from that. Your soul can use the spirit, but the spirit exists whether or not you are incarnated. Even if there was a prior incarnation, there may have been a gap between that incarnation and this one, right? Even in that gap, the spirit is. The temple is real. You can touch it as much as you can touch anything. That's a whole different study. The soul, the part that makes the decisions, appears to be real. I believe it's real, but science doesn't have a conclusive answer, so I say appears to be. And the spirit, as well, appears to be real. It is the part that transforms what is into the next. It's the part that makes you breathe. It's the part that keeps your heart bumping. It's the part that makes your fingers wiggle whenever you decide to make the temple's fingers wiggle. It is not dependent upon your soul that the spirit exists. That's what I was trying to say there. All this, connected with something of the greatest importance, something which carries profound implications, namely, that a few centuries before the mystery of Golgotha, man had entered upon a stage of evolution when something akin to a mist shrouded the soul whenever the spirit was mentioned. This mist was not so dense then as it is now, but the first signs of the corruption of man's thinking in matters of the spirit were already manifest at that time. And this is connected with the fact that in the course of time, mankind has undergone an evolutionary process. That is microevolution, not macro. Over the centuries, man's soul had changed and was no longer the same as it had been in primeval times. Because man possessed atavistic clairvoyance in those remote times, he had direct evidence of the Spirit. I want to look this up. Let's see if I can do that real quick. I want to see what this means. Atavistic. I didn't look it up last time. Displaying characteristics of a previous culture or era, or of a previous ancestral form. Displaying atavism. The recurrence of a trait reappearing after an absence of one or more generations due to a chance recombination of genes. So it is the characteristics of a previous culture or era manifesting itself independently of you. And we do have some reason to believe that. There have been children that have been born with an remembering, right? I don't have that, so I don't speak with authority on it, but there are recollections that are recorded where people remember things from previous existence. That is what's really being said here. Some of it is unintentional, right, from the context, but some of it may be intentional. He could no more doubt the existence of the Spirit than he could doubt the existence of the phenomenal world. It was simply a question of the degree of spiritual perception he could attain. That it was possible to find the path to the Spirit in past ages was never in doubt. Nor was there ever any doubt that during the life between birth and death the Spirit dwelt in the souls of men, so that by virtue of this spiritual endowment, the human soul could participate in divine life. And this conviction, which was founded on an immediate awareness of the Spirit, was at all times expressed in the cult of the mysteries. It is a remarkable fact that one of the earliest Greek philosophers, Heraclitus, speaks of the mysteries in such a way that we realize he is aware of the olden time, that in olden times they were of immense importance to mankind, but they had already fallen into desuetude. Thus, enlightened Greeks had already begun in the 5th century to speak of the decline of the mysteries. Rites of various kinds were enacted in the mysteries, but it is only the central idea of these mysteries which is of particular interest to us today. Let us dwell for a moment on this central idea of the mysteries as they were practiced up to the time of the Mystery of Golgotha and as late as the reign of the Emperor Julian the Apostate. In recent times, attention has been called to the anti-Christian nature of many aspects of these mystery cults. It has been pointed out that what we know as the Easter legend, the keynote to the Passion, the death and resurrection of Christ, can be found everywhere in the mysteries. That is an indisputable fact. Christ is at best a prototype, right? It is entirely possible that he was crucified and rose from the dead. I do not discount that miracle. It does not mean he was divine. Although, throughout history, every single time that happened, and it happened many times, it was attributed to divinity. I don't hold that to be a contradiction, but you might, and that is perfectly fine. At the conclusion drawn from this was the Christian Easter mystery, was simply a transference of the ancient pagan myth and ritual cults to the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Yes. Indeed, these legends and rites were so alike that many no longer questioned their identity and said, what the Christians say of Christ, that he suffered, was crucified and rose again, that his resurrection gave promise of hope and salvation for man, all these Christian ideas are to be found in the mystery cults. Pagan usages, they claimed, had been collected together, fused into the Easter legend, and transferred to the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Also, whenever you see this word, Easter, think of Ishtar. It's the same thing. Indeed, in recent times, people have gone even further. Strangely enough, even in the sphere of Orthodox Christianity, one need only recall certain Protestant sects in Bremen. there was no longer any interest in the historicity of Jesus. They said that the various mystery cults and legends had been collected over the years and had been centralized, so to speak, and that in the early Christian community the Christ legend had been developed out of them. I recall a discussion which took place here in Berlin a few years ago. During the tragic years of recent times, past events had become unreal and seem a distant memory, although the discussion took place only a few years ago. In the course of this discussion, the official representatives of Christianity declared that the real issue was not the historical Jesus, but simply the idea of Christ, which arose in the primitive Christian community through the impact of diverse social impulses. I do not disagree with that, right? We talked in the Bible study about how it is entirely possible that the miracles did happen. But just as Moses took the amalgamation of different stories and created an origin story for the Jewish people, the apostles apparently did the same thing for Christ. That doesn't mean that he couldn't heal people. I believe in spiritual healing. It doesn't mean that he couldn't walk on water. I believe in miracles. It does mean that does not mean that he was divine. It could be the idea of Christ is actually the right way, right? The allegory works. The literal translation doesn't. And if you would like more explanation of that, I refer you back to the Bible study. It is a much longer explanation of that. Now, in studying the pagan mystery cults, there is always a dangerous temptation to compare them with the Christian Eastern mystery. Let me illustrate this by faithful description of the Phrygian Easter festivals. In addition to the Phrygian festivals, I could also cite other festivals, for those were equally widespread. In a letter to the sons of Constantine, Firmicus gives us the following account of the Phrygian Easter festival. The statue of the god Attis was bound to the trunk of a fir tree and carried round in solemn procession at midnight. Then the sufferings of the god were reenacted. At the same time, a lamb was placed at the foot of the tree. At dawn, the resurrection of the god was proclaimed. Whilst on the previous night, when the god was bound to the tree and seemingly given over to death, the multitude broke out in wild lamentations, as was customary during the ritual. Now, when the resurrection of the god was announced at sunrise, the lugubrious chants were suddenly transformed into wild outbursts of joy. The statue of the god, Firmicus tells us, was buried elsewhere. During the night, when the melancholy dirges reached their climax, a light shone in the darkness and the tomb was opened. The god had risen, and the priests addressed the assembled populace with these words, "Take comfort, ye faithful, for the god is saved, and you too will be saved." There is no denying that these religious festivals, celebrated untold centuries before the mystery of Golgotha, show a great similarity to the Easter mystery of Christianity. Because this idea was so attractive, many believe that these ideas of the suffering, death, and resurrection of the god were widespread and had been, to some extent, welded into a unity under Christian influence and transferred to Jesus of Nazareth. That is entirely possible. Now, it is important to understand the real origin of these pagan, pre-Christian rites. They date far back in the past and sprang from those profound and original insights into the nature of man and his relation to the cosmos as revealed through atavistic clairvoyance. Of course, at the time when the Phrygian festivals were celebrated, people did not understand their real meaning any more than the Freemasons of today understand the significance of the rites they practice. We talk about that in the Manly Hall videos. Nonetheless, all these ceremonies date back to a time when an ancient wisdom, a grandiose knowledge of the universe and man existed. A knowledge which is exceedingly difficult to understand today. That is true. Remember that not only is man dependent upon his environment in relation to his physical body, but that his spirit and soul are also an integral part of his environment. He draws on his environment for his ideas and representations. They become routine responses, second nature to him, and for various reasons he cannot escape them. Therefore, with the best will in the world, it is difficult to understand certain knowledge which, for reasons I have already mentioned, has been lost in the course of the spiritual evolution of mankind. The natural science of today, there is no need to repeat my admiration for its achievements, though I harbor certain reservations about it. It's concerned only with the superficial aspects of things. It can only make a minimal contribution to an understanding of their true nature. It is true that science has made great advances in certain spheres, but it all depends upon what one understands by great advances. The invention of wireless telegraphy and many other discoveries which are important contributions to our life today are certainly deserving of admiration. But one may ask, where does that take us? If we were to pursue this question, we should come to face with what is forbidden territory today. Modern science naturally considers the primordial wisdom, the last corrupt remnants of which survived in the mystery cults I have mentioned, to be sheer folly. That may well be, but what is foolishness in the eyes of men may often be wisdom in the sight of God. True insight into the nature of the universe and man discloses, among other things, I propose today to emphasize those aspects which are important for an understanding of the mystery of Golgotha, a certain conception of the human organism, which modern science regards as the height of absurdity. An example, that the human organism is fundamentally different from the animal organism. I have already mentioned many of those differences, but today I will confine myself to the difference which bears upon the mystery of Golgotha. When we make a serious study of the animal organism in light of the spiritual science, we find that it bears within it the seeds of death. In other words, spiritual investigation, when applied to the animal organism, recognizes that, by virtue of its constitution, this organism must inevitably suffer death, that it disintegrates and finally returns to the mineral kingdom. The death of an animal is not something mysterious and inexplicable. When we study its organism, we realize that, for the animal, death is as natural to it, in example the organism, as the need for food and drink. That death is a necessity for the animal lies in the nature of its organism. That is true, but that is also true of the human, right? That is true of the temple. The temple will die. The soul will not. This is not the case with man. I knew that was coming. That's why I said that. Like I didn't know because I read it, but I could intuit. This is not the case for man. With his organism is differently constituted. Here we touch upon a sphere that must remain a total enigma to modern science. When we study the human organism in the light of spiritual science, we find nothing in the human organism itself which suggests that death is inevitable. That has been proven untrue. T cells. We must accept death in man as something he experiences and which cannot be explained, for originally neither man nor his physical organism were made for death. That is a self-insertion. The fact that death occurs in man from within cannot be explained from the being of man itself. The inner being, as such, provides no explanation of death. That has been brought to light by further examination of the sciences. The degradation of the organs, the way that you no longer efficiently use your food or oxygen. Those are real things. They point to the fact that death is an inevitability. To try and separate, because we reason, the physical organism from the difference between these dogs is foolish, right? The physical part is not the difference. The ensoulment is. Now, I believe that they have their own individualized piece of divinity, that they, as dogs, are trying to be the best dogs they can. That does not mean that they think like we do, right? That does not mean that they possess the same position that a human does. But I do believe that they are an individualized piece of God just as much as these glasses are, just as much as the various things that are physically around me are, right? The soul of my house may not be something that I can recognize, but as long as it is together, it is an individualized piece of God, much in the same way that the temple is. Now, we as souls possess the temple. We as souls inhabit the temple. And in 5D space, we use the temple to manipulate. But the supposition that man never died is a wild one, right? It is only through the possibility of other accounts that we even attain to that as a possibility, right? We don't even have any records that say man will live forever. We have in Genesis an account of an explanation for the death of man, but it is not complete by any means and severely lacking in several means. And so this thinking that there is a don't die for the mortal is foolish, right? That doesn't mean that it is entirely wrong, but it is at least conceptually inconsistent. I realize that this view will be regarded as folly by scientific pundits of today. Generally speaking, it is extremely difficult to arrive at an understanding of these problems, for they touch upon profound mysteries. And even today, if we wish to understand these problems, we can only treat of them after the fashion of St. Martin, in his book Des Erreurs et la Vérité. In an important passage, when speaking of the evolutionary consequences that follow from a supernal event that took place in the spiritual world before the man first incarnated on the physical plane, he wrote the following words, which will be readily understood by everyone who is familiar with such matters. However much I may desire to enlighten you, the obligations I have undertaken do not permit me to comment in any way upon this subject. And furthermore, I, for my part, would rather blush for man's transgressions than to speak of them. A lot of that is fear, right? The church held a place of fear for well over a millennium. With good reason. They would do things to you if you talked about things outside of doctrine. The supernal event that took place, I do not believe was necessarily a spiritual one. I believe that there may have been a terrestrial event roughly 12,000 years ago or so, which may have caused some of the changes in the physical body that allowed us to become who we are now. For St. Martin, he is here alluding to a transgression committed by man before his first incarnation of earth. He was forbidden to speak of this openly, but today we are in a position to speak of many things that St. Martin could not discuss in his time. Not because mankind has progressed since that time, but for other reasons. The church is less relevant. But if we were to discuss a truth such as man is not intended to die, together with all of the relevant factors, we would have to touch upon matters which may not be disclosed today. Man is not born to die, and yet he dies. These words express something which is obviously an absurdity to the pundits of modern science, but which, to those who seek to penetrate to a true understanding of the world, must be reckoned among the most profound mysteries. This realization that man was not born to die and yet dies lies concealed in those ancient mysteries, including the Attis mysteries, which I have already mentioned. Man looked to the mysteries for an answer to this enigma that man was not born to die and yet dies. Now, why were the mysteries celebrated? They were celebrated in order that man should be reminded afresh each year of something he wished to hear, something he wished to experience and realize within his soul. He wished to be reassured that the time had not yet come when he would have to face the inexplicable problem of his death. What did the neophyte hope for from the Attis mysteries? He had the instinctive feeling that a time would one day come when mankind would seriously have to face the reality of death, which remained an enigma. But this time had not yet come. And whilst the priest celebrated the death and resurrection of the god, man felt reassured and consoled, for the time had not yet come when he would have to come to terms with the reality of death. And that is pretty much the entire reason why man wants to believe that he was meant to be physically incarnated forever. It is fear. It is misunderstanding of the alignment. It was common knowledge in ancient times that the events described in the first chapter of Genesis, which is understood symbolically today, refer to a reality. The men of ancient times knew this instinctively. It was modern materialism that first outgrew the instinctive feeling that the temptation of Lucifer referred to an actual occurrence. On this question, the materialist interpretation of Darwin, which is intellectually so perverse, is very far removed from the truth. This crude, perverted thinking believes that by a gradual and continual process over long periods of time, man has developed from animal ancestry. In such a materialist hypothesis, the story of the temptation can have no place, for only a brow villainous low could believe that an archetypical ape or guenon could have been tempted by Lucifer. We have already talked about the fall, right? That it was an intentional thing, that we came from the spiritual to the corporeal intentionally. It was not a transgression, but rather a choice. It was not a fall through temptation, but rather the fundamental principles of reality. There is no reason why the immortal God would have to create an immortal race. Why? If there is to be no return to the divine, why even assign out the piece of the divine? I understand that that is me self-inserting my logic into the process. But as I see it, my logic stands, right? We are here to experience the mortal. That precludes us fundamentally from being immortal. Now the soul is immortal. You can neither create nor destroy it upon your own volition, but you can take out the temple by yourself. If at any point we were meant to be immortal, then that would be missing. We would not have the capacity to take ourselves out, much less someone next to us. But the fear of death is a very real thing, right? I'm no longer going to be physically incorporated is a very real fear, and it has been a fear ever since the first person saw the person next to them die. And they didn't even have a clue. They're like, what happened? Instinctively, men knew at the time of the mysteries that the story of creation concealed a fact that had once been common knowledge. They felt that man, as originally created, was not mortal. And because of this fact, they felt that something had entered into his physical organism and had corrupted it, and so opened the doors to mortality. Man became mortal through a moral defect, through what is called original sin. I will recur to this later. Man became mortal not after the fashion of other forms of organic life, not as the inevitable consequence of natural law, but through a moral defect. The soul was the seed of his mortality. The animal soul, as species soul, is immortal. It incarnates in the individual animal, which is mortal in virtue of its organism. The species soul, or group soul, relinquishes the animal organism, which is subject to death, without having undergone any transformation. This is a rationalization, right? This is a self-insertion. You are taking the fact that your soul is completely separate from that. I do not hold that, right? I believe that they are on a different track than us. They are not on the same level as us, so don't get that twisted. But that they are on their own journey, that they have their own purpose, and that God placed them here intentionally. If that is so, then this species soul is not even a thing. Right? different dogs have different uses, right? They do different things. They attain different levels of training and efficiency in that training. That is an individualization. Even within the same species, some dogs don't take to training. You ever heard the saying that dog don't hunt? That's because fundamentally it wouldn't hunt. And what would happen they would put that dog to sleep because they separated that individual organism in a way that I don't. I believe that this is fundamentally incorrect, right? And as a fundamental incorrectness, anything built upon it is wrong. The same as the animal sacrifice being necessary for you to be forgiven from your sin is a fundamental flaw in Judaism. And anything built upon that fact is fundamentally flawed and cannot work. Hence, you can't be forgiven from your sin from someone else's death. From the outset of the nature of the animal organism is such that individual organism, it is ordained to die. This does not apply to the human organism to the same extent, self-insertion. In the case of the human organism, the species soul or group soul, which lies at the root of this organism, is able to manifest in the individual man, and as independent human organism ensures his immortality. Man could only become mortal through a moral act originating in the soul, again self-insertion. In a certain sense, man had to be endowed with the soul before he could become mortal. The moment one treats these ideas as abstractions, they become meaningless. We must endeavor to attain to a concrete knowledge of spiritual realities. That is something I am endeavoring to do, right? I am endeavoring to come to a concrete knowledge of spiritual realities. That may prove to be a fruitless endeavor, but I don't think that it has already, right? I do believe that there are concrete steps to take to attain a knowledge of spiritual realities, and I outline them in the MBTI process, or the Infinite Integrations playlist. Now, in ancient times, and also in the period shortly before the Mystery of Golgotha, men never doubted for a moment that the soul brought death to man. The soul has evolved through the ages. In the course of this evolution, the soul has progressively corrupted the organism and, in consequence, has worked destructively upon the organism. Man looked back to ancient times and said to himself, "A moral event took place in olden times, and its effect upon the soul is such that whenever the soul now incarnates, it corrupts the body." That is some fallacious logic. And because it corrupts the body, man can no longer live between birth and death in the state of innocence. I do not state that that was ever a point, right? The point is to grow, and you do not grow without mistakes. In the course of hundreds and thousands of years, the condition of the soul has grown progressively worse, and the body has suffered continuous corruption. That is debatable. Thus, it is increasingly difficult for man to find his way back to the spirit. The further evolution advances, the more the body is corrupted by the soul, and the more the seeds of death are sown in the body. And a time must come when it will no longer be possible for man, once he has lived his allotted span, to find his way back to the spiritual world. I do not hold to that at all. No longer possible for man to return to the spiritual world is patently untrue according to my beliefs. I believe that you are going back to the spiritual world regardless of anything that you do. So, definitely a vehement disagree for me. In ancient times, it was this moment that was anticipated with fear and dread. Men felt that after countless generations, a generation would arise whose souls would so corrupt the body and sow the poisonous seeds of death that man could no longer reclaim his spiritual heritage. That is different, right? From returning to spiritual and reclaiming your spiritual heritage are two different things. I am helping, hopefully, in this process of reclaiming the spiritual heritage. I could be wrong, but I do not believe I am. And this generation will one day appear, they said. And they wanted to be reassured whether this fatal moment was drawing near, and To this end, the Addis rites and similar ceremonies were enacted. At the same time, they sought to discover whether the souls of men still had so much of divine plenitude that the time had not yet come when these souls had abandoned their divine heritage and could no longer find their way back to the Spirit. Great importance, therefore, was attached to the words of the priest when he said, "Take comfort, ye faithful. The God is saved, your salvation is assured." With these words, the priest wished to indicate that God was still active in the world, that the souls of men had not yet severed all connection with the divine. The priest sought to comfort the people, saying, "The resurrection of the God is ever renewed. The God is still within you." When we touch upon these questions, we become aware of the deep, unplumbed depth of feelings and emotions which were once characteristic of a particular epoch in the evolution of man. Today, man has not the slightest inkling of the inner conflicts which these men of earlier times had to wrestle. Though they may have been totally illiterate and have known nothing of what we call culture today, yet they could not escape those feelings. And in the mystery schools, which preserve the old traditions derived from the ancient clairvoyant insight, the neophytes were told that if evolution were to continue unchanged, if the effects of original sin were to be prolonged, then a time would come when the souls of men would turn from God to a world of materialism of their own creation, and would progressively corrupt the physical body and rapidly hasten the process of death. Now, the argument can be made that we are here, right? A time would come when the souls of men would turn from God. That is definitely a trend in modern society, to a world of materialism, of their own creation. Again, definitely a trend in modern society, and would progressively corrupt the physical body and rapidly hasten the process of death. That is also true. If you do not believe that that is a truth, you have not paid any attention whatsoever to the obesity epidemic. You have paid no attention whatsoever to the diabetic epidemic. You have paid no attention whatsoever to a myriad of these types of things, right? Pharmaceuticals, opioids. We are hastening our death in the things that we do. Some of them we even call extending it. But yet we are poisoning ourselves in very real ways. The use of vegetable oils is one of those ways that we are rapidly hastening the process of death. These souls would remain earthbound and be relegated to the limbo. They would be lost. I do not believe that. But since these schools still preserved a knowledge of the Spirit, the knowledge of the trichotomy of man still survived. What I am speaking of at the moment, the seminaries, applied to the soul and not to the spirit. This still survived. There is a reason, right? I said all the way through the Bible study that despite the best efforts of man, the will of God prevails. There can be truth contained in a book that is not completely true, hence the Bible. There is a path to enlightenment in the Bible. There are things you can discern that will lead you to a better knowledge of God. But that is not what the Bible was written for. The Bible was written to separate you from God. And yet, despite the best efforts of man, the Spirit of God continues. It prevails. And so that I wanted to point that out while we were here. For the Spirit is eternal and follows its own laws. From their spiritual insight, people knew that the soul would be relegated to the limbo, but the spirit would reappear in never repeated earth lives. I hold the opposite view of that, right? The soul and the spirit are transversed in what I believe. A time in the evolution of the world was approaching when the spirits of men would incarnate anew and look back upon the lost paradise which once had existed on earth. Souls would be lost, never to return. Spirits would reincarnate in bodies which they would activate after the fashion of automata, and in the way which this was done could neither felt nor experienced by the soul. Now it is important to note right here, right? Spirit would reincarnate in bodies which they would activate after the fashion of automata. There is a considerable effort to take your consciousness and transfer it to machines. That is enabled by Elon Musk in large part, right? The Neuralink chip is part of that. These robots he just rolled out, they're part of that as well. I do not believe that he is intentionally misaligned. I don't believe he is malicious, but I do believe he is in part working for the other side. But what, on the other hand, were the feelings before those who were drawn to the Christian Easter mystery? They felt that unless the earth received a new impulse, then, in future incarnations, man would be born without a soul. They awaited something that earth evolution could not achieve of itself, something that was destined to enter earthly life from without, namely, the mystery of Golgotha. They awaited the incarnation of a being who would save the souls of men from death. There was no need to save the spirit from death, for it was imperative to save the soul. This being who enters earth evolution from without by incarnation in the body of Jesus of Nazareth was recognized as the Christ who had come to save the souls of men. Now, once again, I do not believe that there is a necessity for any man to come to save your soul. You can repent of your sins directly to God and have them forgiven directly from God without having to have this. This is a rationalization. This is a self-insertion of people who believe in Christ to justify that. Men were now able to unite spiritually with the Christ, so that through this union, the soul loses its power to corrupt the body, and all that they had lost since the fall could gradually be recovered. That is why the mystery of Golgotha must be regarded as the central point in human evolution. From the fall into the mystery of Golgotha, man experienced a progressive decline of his spiritual forces. The forces of corruption had increasingly invaded his soul and threatened to make a man an automaton for the spirit. And from the mystery of Golgotha until the end of the earth cycle, all that was lost before the mystery of Golgotha will gradually be retrieved once more. Thus, at the conclusion of earth evolution, the spirits of men will incarnate in the physical body for the last time, and these bodies will once again be immortal. It was in expectation of this redemption that man understood the mystery of Easter. And again, I take extreme exception to that. I do not believe that even slightly. Before this could be realized, it was necessary to overcome the power which had caused the moral corruption of the soul. And this power was overcome by the decisive event on Golgotha. I disagree. How did early Christians, who still possessed occult knowledge, understand the last words of Christ on the cross? They were living in expectation of an external event that would bring to an end this corrupting influence of the soul. The cry of Christ on the cross, "It is finished," was a sign to them that the time had now come when the corrupting power of the soul was a thing of the past. It was a miraculous event fraught with vast and unsuspected mysteries. For tremendous questions are involved when we think about the mystery of Golgotha. When we pursue our studies further, we shall find that it is impossible to think of the mystery of Golgotha without also thinking of the risen Christ. The risen Christ. That is essential. And in one of his most profound utterances, St. Paul says, "If Christ be not risen, then all of our faith is in vain." And again, I am going to point out that Paul never actually met Christ. The risen Christ is unique to Christianity and is inseparable from Christianity. Tell me about Ra and then come back. The death of Christ is also an integral part of Christianity. But how is this death portrayed, and how must it be portrayed? An innocent man was put to death. He suffered and died. Those who crucified him clearly bear a heavy burden of guilt, for he who died was innocent. What was the significance of this guilt for mankind? It brought them salvation. For, had Christ not died upon the cross, mankind could not have been saved. I, again, vehemently disagree with this particular statement. It is entirely possible for you to turn to God directly. If you say, "Dear Heavenly Father, I ask you to forgive my sins," it is done. It is really that simple. You will experience a change. You should change in accordance with that experience. If not, then you really haven't committed. But nobody else was needed to be involved. You can do it completely separate. The crucifixion is a rationalization at best. I've said it before, and I'm going to hit it here, even though it's probably going to offend somebody. I find this belief a little bit silly, right? That the all-powerful, all-pervading creator of all things is restricted from forgiving you unless you accept the sacrifice is, to me, a silly thing, right? I used to be there, but that was due to a lack of understanding. I am trying to expound upon that understanding, right? It had been thoroughly hammered into me throughout my entire life that I come from a sin nature. And because of that sin nature, it is impossible for you to get into heaven. I don't believe that, right? I don't at all. That is because of the extensive work we did in the Bible study. That changed my view on this. In the crucifixion, we are confronted by a unique event. The death of Christ on the cross was the greatest boon bestowed upon mankind. Cf. John 11:49-52. And the heaviest guilt of man that man has taken upon itself is this, that Christ was crucified. Thus, the heaviest guilt coincides with the greatest good fortune. The superficial mind will no doubt pay little attention to this, but for those who probe deeper, this question is fraught with profound mystery. The most heinous crime in the history of the world proved to be the salvation of mankind. Now, we must understand this enigma, or at least try to understand it, if we are to comprehend the mystery of Golgotha. I want to point out one more thing right here from the Bible. The most heinous crime in the history of the world is debatable. If we go back to the very beginning, there were two brothers. They lived in the world just after the garden. One of them was a farmer. One of them was a herdsman. The herdsman slaughtered his sheep and made a sacrifice, and it was accepted. And the farmer made a sacrifice, and it was not. And you can go back to Genesis for the whys on that. But when his was not, he smacked somebody in the head. That person was innocent. That was the very first murder. Would that not be the most heinous crime in the history of the world? Now we must understand this enigma, or at least try to understand it, if we are to comprehend the mystery of Golgotha. And the key to the solution of this enigma is found in the exemplary words spoken by Christ on the cross. "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." The right understanding of these words provides the answer to the cardinal question: why did the most heinous crime become the source of salvation of mankind? If you reflect upon this, you will realize that one must take into account the trichotomy of man in order to understand the mystery of Golgotha. For Christ died in order to redeem the souls of men. He reclaims the souls of men that would have been lost but for his advent. Morality would have vanished from the earth, and the spirit inhabiting a body that reacted mechanically would have been the victim of necessity in which morality has no place. If this particular part is true, then there can be no morality separate from Christianity, and that is simply not true. Morality existed before Christianity. Now, morals have shifted, right? We've talked about that before. Polygamy used to be a much more common practice. It was well within the morals of the day. Our morals today are different, but we still hold to our morals. Morality is separate from any of the control systems. As a matter of fact, you can find within Taoism several really, really moral people. You can find within Buddhism very moral people. You can find within Shintoism moral people. Just because their morals differ from yours does not mean that they are not moral. Moral is holding to your own code of values. Morality is an intrinsic part of humanity. Now, again, morals do not have to align. My morals and your morals are separate. That would be ethics. The things we have decided as a group are correct, versus morality, which is what I have decided is correct. Mankind would have been unable to have psychic experiences. Again, that is a self-insertion of the major kind. The mission of Christ was to bring man back to God. Now that I agree with. It is not surprising, therefore, that 3 centuries before Christ, Aristotle, a most enlightened Greek, failed to understand the nature of the soul and its relation to the spirit at a time when the crisis of man's soul was at hand. There were many discrepancies in Aristotle's view of the soul, since he could not have known of the coming of the Savior, and it is not surprising, therefore, that his views of the soul were illogical. How was one to account for the fact that the erroneous conceptions of Aristotle concerning the relationship of soul and spirit persisted so long? Because it was not subsumed by a control system. The significance of Christ for the souls of men is that he demonstrates once again that man is a threefold being of body, soul, and spirit, and that an interrelationship exists between objective events and moral events. And we shall never fully understand this relationship unless we accept the idea of the trichotomy of man. If we wish to arrive in some measure at an understanding of the mystery of Golgotha, we must penetrate to the innermost recesses of the human soul. That's not entirely wrong. In the present lecture, I have only been able to offer an introduction to this theme. I believe that it is our immediate concern to speak of these things at the present time. We must take advantage of this Easter festival to inquire more closely into these matters, insofar as it is possible today. Perhaps it may be possible thereby to awaken in us much that one day may be a seed that will only mature in future time. For it is only gradually that we come to realize that we are living in an age when there are many things we cannot fully comprehend. This is evident from the difficulty men experience today in developing a clear and conscious understanding of events that are imminent. Unfortunately, it is not possible to indicate, even briefly, how one should understand in clear consciousness the painful event of which the people of Europe, or at least of Central Europe, have only recently been informed. Today, we are only half aware of these things. I only wanted to touch upon certain questions today in order to relate them in my next lecture to the mystery of Golgotha. There was no reason to do the footnotes, so we are going to go ahead and start to wrap up. Once again, I feel like I have fairly well elucidated my contention with the various hypotheses proposed here. I believe in God, undeniably. I do believe that there is an overriding divine force that controls all things, that everything is part of him. That is the law of one in the 8 laws of creation. It is the very first law for a reason. That within the all, there are differentiations. I am different from you. This dog is different from that dog. They are separations of entity. I believe that every separation of entity is an ensoulment. It is God placing my soul in this temple, and placing your soul in your temple, and placing her soul in her temple. Now, our temples are not the same. My temple and your temple are different. We may have differing health issues, but the spiritual matter is the same in all of us. We have the capacity to get access to the spirit, right? The body and the soul are 2 parts of the 3. The spirit is the part that allows it to happen. It is the part that makes it become. It is through the investment of your energy that you help to co-create this existence that we are in. I do not in any way, shape, or form believe that there was an original sin, that you are condemned forever because of something that happened intentionally through the will of God. That is a little bit of a oxymoronic conundrum, right? If God created you, and God is omnipresent and omniscient, He knows and sees everything. Then how is he ever confused at all? How does he not know clearly beforehand that you will partake of this tree? He does. It is part of the incorporation. The stories that are built into the control systems are to hold you back from access to your spirit. I am trying in a more honest endeavor, well, maybe not honest, a more practical endeavor to relate to you through these various playlists that you can have access to these things. I can be wrong. I always hold the possibility that I can be wrong, but I try to portray confidently because I do feel a fair amount of conviction on this. I do feel like I am correct. If I didn't, I wouldn't be here. I believe that anything I can do, you can do better. How's that for a variation on the song? Anything I can do, you can do better. You can do all the things better than me. All of this you can do and more. You have access to the ability to do those things, but it takes dedication. It takes prayer, fasting, and meditation. It takes seeking the source. You can do them separate. It will repercuss greatly. And that's where I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult topics. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs and that I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those beliefs. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. If I were to tiptoe around it, I couldn't tell you these things are silly. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment. Let me know if you agree or disagree. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. And if you have another text that you would like to see me elucidate upon in the same way I'm doing here, leave that in the comments as well. If you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks, because I do not manifest money. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.